Some boys learned to speak by filling the silence with words. Kalen learned to speak by keeping it. The rancho sat 3 days from the nearest settlement, where the scrub land met the mountains, where the wind carried sounds that most people never learned to hear. When the riders came that morning, dust rising behind them like smoke from a distant fire, Kalen was fixing the fence near the creek. His mother, Nora, was hanging clothes on the line behind their small wooden house. Neither of them knew that in less than an hour, everything they had built would be taken. What the riders didn't know was that the quiet boy watching them approach had already counted their numbers, identified their weapons, and marked the exact moment when talking would end and something far more dangerous would begin. Ken didn't move from his position by the fence. His hands continued working the wire, looping it through the weathered post with the same steady rhythm he'd maintained all morning, but his eyes tracked every detail. 6 riders. The man in front sat differently than the others. Shoulders back, chin raised. A leader, the kind who expected others to step aside. Behind him, 5 more, spread in a loose formation that spoke of experience and violence held barely in check. Nora saw them too. She stopped mid-motion, a damp shirt still in her hands, and turned toward the house. Callan knew what she was thinking. The rifle was inside, propped against the wall near the door. She could reach it in 30 seconds if she ran. But running would show fear, and showing fear to men like these was an invitation. "Keep working," Callan said, quietly, not looking at her. His voice carried the distance between them, despite its softness. They came to talk. First, how he knew this, Nora didn't question. Her son had always known things. Which storms would break before the clouds showed their weight, which trails the deer would take before snow covered the ground, which silences meant peace, and which meant something prowling just beyond the firelight. She'd stopped asking where this knowledge came from years ago. Around the same time she'd stopped asking about the scars that lined his ribs, pale and thin as spider silk in patterns that didn't match any accident she could imagine. The riders stopped 20 feet from the house, close enough to be heard, without shouting, far enough to be outside the range of sudden violence. The formation spoke of men who'd done this before. The leader swung down from his horse, boots hitting the packed earth with deliberate weight. He was brought across the shoulders, face weathered to leather with a scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, pale against the darker skin. His eyes moved from Nora to Kalen and back again, calculating this demoraic place. His voice carried the rough edge of too many years in dry wind and dust. "It is," Nora said. She'd set down the shirt now, hands empty at her sides. Callan recognized the stance, the same one she took when she was preparing for something she didn't want, but knew was coming anyway. "Name's Rake. These lands belong to my brother. I've come to collect what's mine." Nora's jaw tightened. "These lands were sold to my husband 15 years back. Legal witnessed, recorded." That so Rake's smile didn't reach his eyes. Funny thing about records, they have a way of getting lost, especially when the only person who might argue about it is buried up on that hill. He gestured toward the small rise behind the house where 2 wooden markers stood against the sky. Kalen's hands had stopped moving. The wire hung loose from the post. He turned slowly, facing the riders fully for the first time. 6 pairs of eyes found him. Most dismissed him immediately. A boy thin, no gun visible, not worth consideration. But Rake's gaze lingered a moment longer. Something in the way the boy stood perfectly still, weight balanced, watching them with eyes that didn't blink, like something that lived in deep water, waiting. "The boy yours?" Rake asked. "Mine?" Nora confirmed. "Good. Then you want to keep him safe." Rake pulled a folded paper from inside his coat, holding it up. "I've got men who will swear my brother never sold this place. Men who will testify in any court that matters. You can fight it if you want. Spend every dollar you've got on. Lawyers, while you watch this place fall apart around you. Or he let the word hang. You can be reasonable. Reasonable? Nora repeated the word flat. You sign over the deed. Pack what you can carry. I'll even give you 3 days to clear out more mercy than most would show. And if I don't, Rake's smile widened. Then things get difficult. The silence that followed felt like something alive. The kind of quiet that pressed against eardrums and made hearts beat faster. Kalen could hear his mother's breathing, slightly elevated but controlled. Could hear the leather creaking as one of the riders shifted his weight in the saddle. Could hear faint and far off the sound of water moving over stones in the creek bed. 3 days, Rake said again. Starting now. That's when one of the men behind him, young and eager in the way that meant stupid, spoke up. What if we just take what we want? Why are we asking permission? Rake didn't turn. Because I'm a civilized man, Corey. I believe in doing things proper. But Corey had already dismounted. He was walking toward Nora, hand reaching out as if to grab her arm. Seems like we could convince them faster if he never finished the sentence. Kalen moved. One moment he was standing by the fence, hands empty. The next, he was between Corey and his mother, and Corey was doubled over on the ground, gasping for air. Kalen had driven his fist hard into the man's stomach before Corey even realized he'd moved, knocking the wind completely out of him. The speed of the strike, not its force, was what surprised everyone. The other riders had their hands on their weapons instantly, but Rake raised one finger. Hold! Kalen stood over Corey, looking down at him with the same expression he'd worn watching the fence wire. Patient, waiting. After several long seconds, Corey's breathing returned in ragged gasps, his face red from the effort. Fast hands. Rake's voice had changed. No longer casual, now careful. Callan didn't answer, just turned and walked back to his position by the fence, picking up the wire where he'd left off. Rake watched him for a long moment. Then he mounted his horse in one smooth motion. 3 days, he said to Nora. And you might want to teach your boy that tricks like that won't save him when there's a rifle pointed at his back. They rode out the way they'd come. Corey, mounting last, still rubbing his chest and looking back at Ken with something between fear and fury. When the dust had settled and the sound of hooves had faded, Nora walked over to where Ken stood. They'll be back before 3 days. I know they'll bring more men. I know. She studied his face, seeing something there. She'd learned to recognize over the years. A decision already made. A path already chosen. What are you going to do? Kalen finished tying off the wire. Tested it with one hand. Solid. Then he turned and looked toward the mountains, toward the high country, where the trees grew thick and the land belonged to. People who'd been there long before anyone thought to draw property lines or write deeds. I'm going to get help, he said quietly. And the way he said it, Nora knew that help meant something these men couldn't imagine. Something that would change everything. Something that had been waiting perhaps for this exact moment. But she also knew that once her son walked into those mountains, once he asked for what he was about to ask for, there would be no going back. The life they'd built here, quiet and separate, would end, and whatever came after would be written in blood and dust, and the kind of justice that didn't wait for courtrooms or civilized men. Kalen was already walking toward the house to gather what he needed. And Nora, standing alone by the fence, with the wind picking up and the sun starting its descent toward the western peaks, felt the first cold touch of certainty that the quiet was over. They came back before dawn, not in 3 days, not even in 3 hours. The sun hadn't fully risen when Ken heard the horses returning, more of them this time, their hooves drumming a rhythm that spoke of purpose and numbers. He was already awake, had been since midnight, sitting on the porch with his bedroll packed and ready beside him. Waiting, Nora emerged from the house, rifle in hand. She'd heard them, too. How many? 10, maybe 12. Callan stood, slowly, hands visible and empty. They brought enough to make sure we can't fight. We could run, take the horses, and ride for they'd catch us before noon. He looked at her, and in the dim pre-dawn light, his face seemed older. Then 15, and they'd be angry when they did. The riders spread out in a half circle around the house, blocking every direction except back toward the mountains. Rake rode at the center, and this time he wasn't smiling. 2 men dismounted and walked toward the house with lengths of rope in their hands, not bothering to conceal their intention. Changed my mind about the 3 days, Rake called out. Figured it was too generous. You're going to sign those papers right now, boy, or your mother's coming with us until you do. Kaylin didn't move. She hasn't done anything. Don't need her to do anything. Just need her alive and somewhere you'll worry about. Rake gestured to his men. Take her. Nora raised a rifle, but Kaylin put his hand on the barrel, gently pushing it down. Don't, Callan. 1 rifle. Against 12. You'll die here if you fight. His voice was steady, but his eyes never left Rake. I'll get you back. Smart boy, Rake said. Knows when he's beaten. The 2 men reached the porch. One of them grabbed Nora's arm, while the other yanked the rifle from her hands. She didn't resist, but her eyes stayed locked on her son's face, searching for something. Reassurance, a plan. Anything that said this wasn't the end. Kaylin gave the smallest nod. Trust me, they bound her wrists with rough efficiency, the kind that came from practice. Rake produced the papers again, holding them out. Sign these and she comes back unharmed tomorrow. Refuse and we'll see how long your pride lasts. While she's eating our scraps and sleeping on cold ground. 3 days? Callan said quietly. What's that? You said 3 days before. I'm holding you to it. 3 days and I'll have your answer. Rake studied him then laughed. 3 days then, but every hour after that she suffers for your stubbornness. He wheeled his horse around. Bring her. They lifted Nora onto one of the spare horses, tying her bound hands to the saddle horn. She sat straight back, refusing to show fear. But Kaylin could see the tension in her shoulders, could see the way her jaw was set against whatever words she wanted to say. The riders began moving out, and Kaylin watched from the porch, motionless as stone. One of the younger men spat in the dirt near his feet as they passed. Coward. Won't even fight for his own blood. Callan's eyes followed them until they crested the first rise and dropped out of sight. Then he turned and walked into the house. 2 minutes later, he emerged with his pack, a canteen and a knife at his belt. No rifle, no gun. He didn't need them where he was going. The sun was just breaking over the eastern plains when he started walking west toward the high country, toward the mountains where the pine trees grew so thick that daylight never fully reached the ground, toward territory that the maps called empty because the men who drew those maps didn't have permission to know what was really there. His mother had 3 days, but Kaylin had learned long ago that 3 days could be enough time to move mountains if you knew who to ask. And he knew exactly who to ask. The same people who pulled him from a riverbank 7 years ago when he was 8 years old and drowning. The same people who taught him to read the land like words on a page. The same people who owed him a debt that ran deeper than blood because he'd saved one of their own when everyone else had given up hope. Kaylin walked fast, steady, conserving strength. By noon, he'd covered more ground than most men could manage in a full day. By sunset, he'd be in the foothills. By dawn, tomorrow, he'd be where the treaties ended and the old laws still held. And then the quiet boy would speak. And when he did, 1,000 warriors would listen. The land changed as Kaylin climbed. Scrubland gave way to rocky slopes, then to stands of juniper that clung to the hillsides like desperate fingers. By afternoon, he'd reached the pine forest where the air smelled of resin and old earth, and the temperature dropped 10 degrees in the shade. His legs burned from the constant upward climb, but he couldn't slow. Every hour that passed was an hour his mother spent bound and frightened in Rake's camp. The trail he followed wasn't marked on any map. Most people who stumbled onto it thought it was a game trail, something carved by deer or elk. Over centuries, they were half right. Animals had used it. But long before that, people had used it too. People who'd learned to move through this country when the only law was survival and the only currency was respect. Kalen's mind kept pulling him backward to another time. 7 years ago, late summer, he'd been 8 years old and stupid with the kind of confidence that comes from never having faced real consequences. His father had been alive then, and they'd come up into these foothills hunting. Kalen had wandered too far from camp, following what he'd thought was a deer trail down to a creek. The bank had been wet from recent rain, slick with mud. His feet had gone out from under him, and suddenly he was in the water, current stronger than it. Looked, pulling him downstream toward where the creek narrowed between two rocks. He'd gone under 3 times before someone grabbed his shirt and hauled him onto the bank. Not his father, a boy about his age, Apache, with black hair wet against his skull and eyes that held no fear of the water that had nearly killed Kalen. The boy had pulled him up, pounded his back until he stopped choking, then stood and called out in a language Kalen didn't understand. 3 men had appeared from the trees. Warriors they'd looked at, Ken with expressions that ranged from curiosity to contempt. A white boy far from where he should be, nearly drowned in water that Apache children swam in from the time they could walk. But they hadn't heard him, had instead brought him back to his father's camp, returned him like lost property, and disappeared back into the forest without a word. His father had been furious, terrified, had packed up immediately and ridden back to the ranch without finishing the hunt. But Ken had looked back at the tree-in as they rode away and had seen the boy standing there watching. Something had passed between them in that moment. Recognition, maybe, or just the simple understanding that one life had been traded for another, and debts like that didn't expire. For years later, Ken had paid it back. He'd been tracking a lost calf in the high meadows when he'd heard splashing and shouting. A young Apache boy, maybe 6 years old, had fallen through thin ice on a beaver pond. The ice was breaking apart under his weight every time he tried to climb out. 2 Apache women were on the bank, screaming, unable to reach him without going through themselves. Callan hadn't thought, had just moved. He'd crawled out on a fallen log that extended part way over the pond, reaching down as far as he could. The boy grabbed his hand, and Ken had pulled with everything he had, feeling the log start to roll under his weight. But he'd gotten the boy close enough for one of the women to reach out and grab him, hauling him to safety just as the log gave way, and dumped Ken into the freezing water. He'd made it to shore, gasping and shaking. And when he'd looked up, the boy he'd saved 7 years ago was standing there, older now, broader, harder, but the same eyes. And behind him, a dozen warriors, all watching Callan with expressions that had changed from the last time. No longer contempt, now something closer to respect. The older boy had spoken in halting English. "You are the one who fell in the creek." Callan had nodded, teeth chattering too. Hard to speak. "My brother, son, you saved him." Another nod. The older boy had looked at him for a long moment, then said something in Apache to the other warriors. Whatever he said there, postures had shifted, softened. One of them had brought a blanket, wrapped it around Kalen's shoulders. Another had built a fire. That night, they'd shared food with him, had walked him halfway back to the ranch land before dawn. And the older boy, whose name Kalen had learned was Nishoba, had gripped his shoulder and spoken in careful English. "Debt's repaid, but friendship does not expire like debt. You need help. You come to us." Now, climbing through the forest 7 years later, Kalen was coming to collect on that promise. The trees were thinning ahead. He could see open sky and beyond at the high plateau where the Apache made their seasonal camps, where Nshobo would be, where 1,000 warriors could gather if the cause was. And the call was made by someone they trusted. Kalen emerged from the tree and just as the sun touched the western peaks. Below him, scattered across the plateau in careful arrangement, were the wiki, UPS, and lodges of the Apache camp. Smoke rose from cooking fires. Children played near the creek that ran through the center. Women worked hides and tended gardens. And at the camp's edge, already watching him approach, stood 3 warriors with rifles across their chests. They'd seen him coming long before he'd seen them. Had probably been tracking him since he entered the forest. Now they waited, expressions unreadable, to see what this white boy wanted badly enough to walk alone into Apache territory without weapon or invitation. Kalen raised both hands, palms out, and spoke the only Apache word he knew with certainty. Neshoba. The 3 warriors looked at each other. Then one of them turned and ran toward the camp center, moving with the efficient speed of a man carrying urgent news. The other 2 kept there, rifles ready and their eyes on Ken, waiting to see if he was brave or just foolish, and whether there was any difference between the 2. The warrior who'd run into camp returned with a dozen others, and at their center walked Neshoba. He was broader now than when Kalen had last seen him, shoulders thick, with muscle earned from years of hunting and fighting. A scar ran across his left forearm. He stopped 10 feet from where Ken stood and studied him with eyes that revealed nothing. "You come alone," Neshoba said in English. Not a question, an observation. "I need help. White men always need help when they come here." This from an older warrior. To Neshoba's left, speaking in accented but clear English. His face was lined like weathered leather. "They need our land, our water, our game. Now you come wanting more." Kalen kept his eyes on Neshoba. "My mother was taken. Men came with guns and ropes. They want our land, and they took her to force me to give it up. I have 3 days to get her back. So go to your soldiers, your courts, your law. The nearest fort is 5 days' ride. She doesn't have 5 days." Kalen spoke directly to Neshoba. "You told me. Friendship doesn't expire. You said if I needed help, I should come to you. I'm here." Neshoba's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture. "How many men took her?" 12. Maybe more by now. "And you want us to fight your battles against your own people?" "I want what was promised. You offered friendship. I'm asking you to honor it." The older warrior stepped forward. "You save 1 child and think. You can call 1,000 warriors to die for you. You have no claim on us. I have the right that Neshoba gave me." Ken's voice stayed level. "When I pulled his brother's son from that ice, I didn't ask what people he came from. Didn't ask if it was worth the risk. I just did it. Now I'm asking for the same." Neshoba held up one hand, silencing the older warrior. He walked forward until he stood directly in front of Kalen. "You know what you ask? If we ride against white men, more will come. There will be war. There's already war. It's just been slow and quiet. They take your land piece by piece. Hunt your game until there's nothing left. Sign treaties and break them before the ink dries. And you think 12 men are worth starting that war openly? I think my mother is worth it." Kim met his eyes. "And I think you know that if you don't honor what you promised, then promises mean nothing. The next time you ask someone to trust you, they'll remember that you let this one stand alone when he needed you most." The silence that followed felt heavy enough to crush stone. The gathered warriors watched Neshoba waiting. Some looked angry, others thoughtful, a few seemed almost eager. Noba turned to the older warrior. "Takakota, how many warriors are in camp now?" "Perhaps 200. Another 300 are within 2 days' ride. If we send runners, send them." Neshoba looked back at Ken. "But not for you. Not for your mother. We do this because Rake and men like him have been pushing at our borders for years, taking what isn't theirs. You give us a reason to push back, so you'll help. We'll ride at dawn. Every warrior who can hold a weapon By the time we reach your land, we'll have 800, maybe 1,000. Neshoba's expression hardened. But know this, when we ride for war. There will be blood, and there will be no going back to how things were before. Kalan nodded slowly. How things were. Before wasn't working. Anyway, Neshoba turned and began giving orders in Apache. Rapid and decisive. Warriors, scattered, running to their lodges. Within minutes, the entire camp was moving with purpose. Weapons appeared. From storage, horses were gathered. Women began packing provisions. Takakoda approached Kalen. You'll ride with us. I'll lead you to them. And when we get there, when the fighting starts, Kalan looked toward the western horizon where somewhere beyond the mountains his mother sat bound and frightened. When the fighting starts, I'll be first through their camp. Takakoda grunted something that might have been approval. Get food. Get rest. Dawn comes early. But Ken didn't rest. Instead, he sat at the camp's edge, watching the preparations, counting the warriors as they gathered, watching an army form. Around a promise made years ago, and he thought about his mother. Hoped she was holding on. Hoped she could last just one more day. Because tomorrow, every man who touched her would learn what happened when you threatened someone who had friends in places you couldn't imagine. Dawn broke cold over the Apache camp. Kalen watched the sun rise, sleepless but alert. Behind him, 800 warriors prepared for war. Horses being saddled, weapons checked, low voices in Apache. Neshoba appeared, a pint across his cheekbones. Runners returned. Nearly 1,000 now. Kalan stood. Enough. Rake has 15 men, but they'll have position. They're arrogant. They think I'm a boy who will sign papers. Mount up. The column moved out. 1,000 warriors on horseback, flowing across the plateau into the passes. Kalen rode near front with Neshoba and Takakoda. 20 miles south, Nora sat against a boulder, wristbound. Her face was bruised, but her eyes were clear. Watching, counting men, noting routines. Rake cleaned his rifle by the fire. Day 2. Your boy has one more day. After that, things get unpleasant. He won't. Cool me. Rake glanced up. No, he'll come. Not the way you expect. He's one boy. I have 15 men. 3 days from any law. Nora smiled slightly. Rake turned back to his rifle, confident. Corey approached. Saw dust on the northern ridge. From what? Couldn't tell. Probably deer. You're jumping at shadows. There's been smoke signals. 2 nights. High country. Rake looked up. Apache could be. They haven't come down in years. Treaty keeps them up. There. Might want extra watch. Fine. Double watch. They're not coming for us. The Apache column covered ground fast. They rode without stopping, switching horses when needed. Warriors silent, saving breath. Kalen pushed harder. Neshoba shot him a look. Slow down. My mother doesn't have time. She needs you alive when we arrive. Firm tone. We'll get there before dawn. Rake. Want a time to breathe. Kalen eased back, but his hands gripped the reins tight, eyes turning south. One more. Night. Rake sat by his fire, comfortable, surrounded by men. No idea. The quiet boy was leading an army toward him. No idea that by sunrise everything would be torn away. No idea he'd bet his life on the wrong assumption. The Apache column rode through the night, through narrow passes where rocks rose like walls across plateaus painted silver by moonlight. Kalen rode without speaking, calculating where guards would be, where horses quarreled, where his mother held. Neshoba read his thoughts. When we arrive, stay back until we secure camp. No, not a request. Not your mother. Quiet, but unyielding. I'll be first in. Takakoda made a sound that might have been amusement. The boy has stubbornness. Stubbornness gets you killed. Neshoba said. So does hesitation. I know the camp layout. You need me in front. Silence. Then Noba nodded once. First in, but you follow my signals. We move as one force. I'm not seeking glory. I'm seeking my mother. Then we understand each other. The column pressed on, sky lightening with. Approaching dawn. Ahead, Rake and his men slept confident. Ahead, Nora waited, bound but unbroken. In between, darkness and coming light, a quiet boy who'd once nearly drowned was about to show 15 men what happened. When you underestimated silence. By the time the first guard at Rake's camp saw movement on the horizon, it was already too late. The Apache warriors had spread into a wide crescent formation, moving with the kind of coordinated precision that came from generations of tactical knowledge. They made almost no sound despite their numbers. No shouting, no war cries, just the steady rhythm of 1,000 horses moving across hard ground. The guard rubbed his eyes, certain he was seeing things. Then the shapes resolved into individual riders, and the scale of what was approaching hit him like a physical blow. He opened his mouth to shout a warning, but the sound died in his throat as he realized that by the time anyone in camp woke and armed themselves, those riders would already be surrounding them completely. He ran, anyway, stumbling toward the fire where Rake slept. Behind him, the horizon continued to darken with approaching riders. 1,000 warriors answering a promise made years ago. Coming for a mother, coming for justice, coming to teach arrogant men a lesson they wouldn't live long enough to forget. The guard shouts woke Rake from sleep. He rolled from his bedroll, already reaching for his rifle. Instinct sharp, from years of living on the edge of violence. Around him, his men scrambled to their feet, confused and disoriented. In the pre-dawn darkness. What is it? Rake demanded. The guard pointed north with a shaking hand. Riders, hundreds, maybe more. Rake looked. What he saw made his stomach drop. The horizon was lined with mounted warriors stretched in a crescent formation that extended far beyond the edges of his camp. As the sky lightened, more details emerged. War paint, rifles, bows, lances, and at the center, sitting straight back on his horse, was the quiet boy who was supposed to be home crying over signed papers. How many? One of Rake's men whispered. Too many. Rake's mind was racing, calculating angles and options. None of them good. Get the horses. We ride out the south side while look south. Rake turned. More warriors. The Apache had surrounded them completely during the night. There was no south side, no escape route, just a circle of mounted men with weapons ready and expressions that promised no mercy. Corey grabbed Rake's arm. What do we do? We negotiate. Rake forced confidence into his voice that he didn't feel. They want something or they would have. Attacked already. Get the woman. Bring her here where they can see her. 2 men dragged Nora to the fire. She didn't fight them, but her eyes found Kalen immediately. He sat motionless on his horse 50 yards away, watching, waiting. Rake pulled Nora in front of him, one arm around her throat, his other hand holding a knife where the warriors could see it. That's close enough, he called. Out. His voice carried across the open ground. I don't know what this boy told you, but this is between us. Private. Business. No reason for Apache to be involved. Neshoba urged his horse forward a few steps. When he spoke, his voice was calm but carried weight. You took this woman by force. You threatened her son. You claimed land that isn't yours. These things make it our business. She's not hurt. Just making sure the boy understands his responsibilities. His responsibility is to his mother. Yours is to leave and never return. Rake laughed, but it sounded hollow. Leave? You surrounded my camp, brought an army, and now you're asking me politely to leave. I'm giving you a choice you don't deserve. Release her now. Walk away and you live. Keep holding her. And when the sun clears those peaks, we come for you. If you come, she dies first. Nora spoke then, her voice steady despite the knife at her throat. Do it. Rake tightened his grip. What? I said do it. Kill me if you want, but it won't save you. My son brought 1,000 warriors. You brought 15 men. Your math doesn't work. Rake looked at his men. They were terrified. Some had already dropped their weapons. Others were looking at the surrounding warriors and making calculations about how long they'd last in a fight. Not long, maybe seconds. Kalen hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, just watched with those patient eyes that saw everything and revealed nothing. Rake's knife hand was starting to shake. This is about the land. Just sign the papers. And no, Kalen's voice cut through the morning air. The first word he'd spoken since arriving. Let her go. Or what? Kalan looked at Noba, nodded once. The sound that followed was like nothing Rake had ever heard. 1,000 warriors raising weapons, not shouting, not threatening, just the mechanical click and scrape of rifles being cocked, bows being drawn, lances being leveled, all in perfect coordination, all pointed at Rake's camp. One of Rake's men dropped his rifle and raised his hands. I'm done. I didn't sign up for this. Shut up, Rake hissed. Another man dropped his weapon. Then another. Within seconds, half of Rake's men had surrendered, hands high, faces pale. Rake was alone with his knife and his hostage and his pride, and the sun was climbing higher, burning away the last shadows of night. Kalen sat on his horse, silent as stone, while behind him 1,000 warriors waited for the order that would end this in blood. Rake looked into Nora's eyes and saw no fear there, only certainty. She knew how this would end, had probably known since her son walked into those mountains 2 days ago. Last chance, Nishoba called. Let her go, or we come. Now, Rake's hand trembled on the knife. 15 men against 1,000. No escape. No reinforcements. No clever plan that would save him. Just math that didn't work and warriors who didn't bluff. He lowered the knife. But before he could let Nora go, before he could say the words that might save his life, Corey did something stupid. He raised his rifle, aimed at Kalen, and fired. The shot echoed across the camp. Kalen's horse reared, and for one frozen moment, everyone watched to see if the bullet had found its target. Kalen swayed in the saddle, grabbed the horse's mane, and stayed mounted. Blood appeared on his left shoulder, spreading dark across his shirt, but he didn't fall. What happened next happened fast. The Apache warriors moved as one entity, not chaotic, not wild, disciplined, and coordinated like water flowing around stones. They swept into the camp from all sides. And Rake's men, already half surrendered, dropped flat on the ground, with hands over their heads. Corey tried to chamber another round, but Dakota was already on him. The old warrior moved, with speed that belied his age, knocking the rifle aside and driving Corey into the dirt. Within seconds, Corey was face down with 3 warriors holding him. Rake shoved Nora away and reached for his own rifle, but Nora kicked it beyond his reach. She stood between him and his weapon, hands still bound, face bruised, but eyes blazing. You made your choice. Nshoba reached the fire, dismounting in one smooth motion. He grabbed Rake by the collar and threw him to the ground next to his men. Stay down. Kalen rode into camp, one hand pressed against his bleeding shoulder. He slid from his horse with visible effort, legs unsteady but determined. He walked past the surrendered men, past the warriors holding them, straight to where his mother. You're hurt, Nora said. I'm fine. He pulled the knife from his belt and cut the ropes around her. They fell away, and Nora pulled her son into an embrace, careful of his wounded shoulder. For a long moment, they stood like that, mother and son, while around them, warriors secured the camp and disarmed the last of Rake's men. Nshoba approached, studying Kalen's shoulder. That needs cleaning. After Kalen turned to face Rake, the man was on his knees now, surrounded by Apache warriors. All the arrogance was gone, just fear and the dawning realization of how badly he'd miscalculated. You took my mother, Kalen said quietly. Threatened her, hurt her. You thought I was just a boy. Thought you could take What you wanted because you had more men and more guns. Rake said nothing. What could he say? You were wrong. Kalen looked at Neshoba. What happens to them now? Apache law says a man who harms others without cause faces judgment. Your people have courts. We have different ways. Neshoba's expression was hard. These men threaten not just your mother. They've been taking Apache land, hunting our game, pushing at our borders for years. You gave us reason to push back. Now we finish it. Rake found his voice. You can't. There are laws, treaties. You should have remembered those when you put a knife to an innocent woman's throat. Neshoba turned to his warriors, speaking rapid Apache. They began rounding up Rake's men, binding their hands with rope. What are you doing? Rake demanded. Taking you to the nearest fort. Letting your own law decide what happens to men who kidnap women and steal land. Neshoba's smile was cold. We're civilized people. We believe in following proper procedures. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Rake had counted on being too far from law to face consequences. Now the Apache were ensuring he'd face exactly that. Kalen watched as the men were bound and placed on horses. Corey was screaming that he'd only been following orders. The others were silent, faces pale, understanding that their lives had changed permanently in the space of one sunrise. Nora stood beside her son, one hand on his good shoulder. You walked into those mountains alone. I wasn't alone once I got there. You could have been killed. So could you. She looked at the warriors surrounding them. At the careful way they moved and organized. At Neshoba, giving orders with the authority of someone who'd led men through harder situations than this. How did you know they'd come? Neshoba promised. And he keeps his promises. Kalen looked at his mother. Same as I keep mine. I said I'd get you back. At what cost? Kalan glanced at his bleeding shoulder. Worth it. The Apache began moving out, taking Rake and his men with them. A dozen warriors stayed behind to help Kalen and Nora gather their belongings. The camp was dismantled efficiently. All signs of occupation erased within an hour. Neshoba approached one last time before riding out. The fort is 3 days north. We'll make sure they arrive and face justice. After that, we return to our territory. Thank you. Don't thank me. This was as much for my people as yours. But the debt is settled now. What you and I have after this is just friendship. No more obligations. Kalan nodded. Friendship is enough. Neshoba gripped his good shoulder briefly then, mounted and rode after his warriors. Within minutes, the Apache column was moving north, taking Rake and his men toward whatever justice waited for them. Nora and Kalen stood alone in the empty camp, watching them go. The sun was fully up now, burning away the last of the morning cold. Birds were starting to sing. The world was continuing as if nothing had changed, but everything had changed, and they both knew it. 3 weeks after the Apache rode away with Rake and his men, a rider came from the fort carrying news. Kalen was mending fence when he saw the dust rising from the east. His shoulder was still healing, wrapped tight beneath his shirt, but he could work again carefully. The rider was a young soldier, barely older than Kalen himself. He dismounted at the house and handed Nora an official document with the fort commander's seal. She read it twice, then looked up at Ken, who'd walked over from the fence line. Rake was tried by military tribunal, kidnapping, attempted murder, land fraud. They sentenced him to 15 years hard labor at the territorial prison. She folded the paper carefully. His men got lesser sentences, some as little as 2 years. But Corey, the one who shot you, got 10 years. The soldier cleared his throat. Commander wanted you to know the Apache testimony was crucial. They had witnesses too. Everything. Couldn't dispute the facts with that many people telling the same story. He paused. Also wanted me to tell you the land deed is secure. No one can challenge your claim now. It's official record. After the soldier left, Ken and Nora stood in the yard looking at their small ranch. The same wooden house, the same corrals and fences, the same scrub. Land stretching to the mountains. Nothing had changed physically, but everything felt different. You could have died, Nora said quietly, walking into those mountains alone, asking for help from people most whites fear. You raised me to know the difference between people who keep promises and people who break them. Noba keeps his promises. And now we live same as before, but without anyone trying to take what's ours. Over the following months, life settled into new patterns. Ken's shoulder healed, leaving a scar he'd carry forever. A reminder of the morning, 1,000 warriors surrounded 15 men and showed them what real power looked like. Not guns or threats or stolen land, just people standing together for something that mattered. Occasionally, riders would pass through Apache territory and bring news. Rake was working a stone quarry, breaking rocks from dawn to dusk. Corey had tried to escape once and added 3 years to his sentence. The others served their time quietly, knowing they'd gotten off lighter than they deserved. Sometimes, when Ken rode in the high country to check on stray cattle, he'd find signs that Apache hunters had passed through. A stone can marking a trail, tracks near a water source. Once he found a deer, already dressed and hanging from a tree with no one around to claim it. He took it home, and Nora made stew that lasted a week. He never saw Neshoba again face to face, but he knew the Apache leader was out there somewhere in those mountains, living his life the same way Kalen lived his, keeping promises, protecting what mattered, standing with friends when it counted. Years later, when people asked Ken about the scars on his ribs and shoulder, or why he spent so much time looking at the mountains, he'd give them the same answer. Some debts you pay forward. Some friendships don't need words. And some promises last longer than the people who make them. Nora grew old on that ranch, never bothered again by men who wanted what wasn't theirs. She watched her son become a man who knew the value of silence and the power of knowing when to speak, who understood that real strength wasn't in how much you could take, but in how much you'd sacrifice for people who couldn't protect themselves. And on quiet evenings when the wind came down from the high country carrying the scent of pine and old earth, both of them would look toward those distant peaks and remember the morning a quiet boy brought 1,000 warriors. Remember when promises were kept and justice was served. Remember when 15 men learned that some people, no matter how quiet, should never be underestimated. The land was theirs, the life was theirs, and nobody would take it again. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale from the frontier, where courage and destiny collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these.